You don't own your life. You just rent it from systems that expect compliance. Your body, your time, your choices, all negotiated through laws, norms, and people who think they know better. The moment you try to take full control, suddenly everyone has a claim.
Good evening, my friends. Today we have a fun topic before us. The central issue is not whether death is tragic, frightening, regrettable, culturally destabilizing, spiritually offensive, or emotionally difficult for other people to witness. The central issue is whether a competent adult has the right to decide that they do not wish to continue existing, and whether the state may justly override that decision simply because it disapproves of the conclusion. Everything else is secondary. The grief of observers, the anxieties of policymakers, the instincts of doctors, the moral panic of activists, the symbolism of suicide, the discomfort of families, the political fear of abuse, and the sentimental worship of survival are all downstream from the prior question, who owns a person's life in the final sense? The individual living it, or the institutions, communities, and people surrounding them? A society that claims to value liberty has to answer that question honestly, not poetically, not evasively, not by reciting a script about protecting the vulnerable while quietly asserting ownership over the bodies and futures of the very people it claims to defend. If the answer is that the individual owns their own life, then that ownership cannot stop at speech, religion, voting, marriage, employment, medical refusal, or lifestyle choices. It must extend to the most serious question of all, whether to go on. If the answer is that the state or communities may compel continuation of life against a competent person's will, then the state does not merely regulate conduct, it claims partial sovereignty over the person themselves. That is the contradiction modern democracies try to hide. They speak the language of self-determination in nearly every domain, but when a person says clearly and persistently, "I do not consent to continue," the rhetoric of freedom suddenly evaporates. Autonomy becomes conditional. Bodily sovereignty becomes decorative. Consent becomes sacred only when it leads to the approved answer. This is paternalism with better branding. The usual defense of this contradiction is that death is irreversible, and therefore the state has special justification to interfere. But irreversibility alone does not create moral authority. Plenty of irreversible choices are permitted in free societies. People marry, divorce, reproduce, refuse treatment, enter combat, undergo sterilization, donate organs, ruin their health with legal substances, and structure their lives around commitments that cannot easily be undone. The state or society does not ban these decisions merely because they are grave. It may impose procedures, waiting periods, informed consent requirements, or capacity standards, but it does not typically say, because this choice matters deeply, it no longer belongs to you. That move is reserved almost exclusively for continued existence, which reveals something important. The objection is not really about irreversibility. It is about a taboo. Society is willing to accept adult freedom only so long as that freedom ultimately serves life. That taboo is philosophically weak. There is no coherent account of self-ownership that permits a competent person to refuse chemotherapy, reject dialysis, sign a DNR, or leave a dangerous surgery undone, yet forbids them from making the broader judgment that they do not wish to remain alive at all. Once you grant that a person's body is not state property, and once you grant that a person may decline interventions even when death will predictably follow, the moral foundation for absolute prohibition collapses. At that point, all that remains are arguments about process, competence, coercion, and social consequences. Those are arguments about safeguards. They are not arguments against the underlying right. That distinction matters because opponents constantly blur it. They take concerns that might justify procedural protections and inflate them into reasons to deny self-determination outright. This is a category error disguised as compassion. It works like this. Some people may seek death under pressure, therefore no one may be trusted with the option. Some people may choose under despair, therefore the choice itself is invalid. Some people may act from circumstances society should remedy, therefore society is entitled to compel their continued existence instead. This reasoning is structurally absurd. By that logic, Any right exercised under less than ideal conditions would cease to be a right. Since human life is never lived under pristine conditions, autonomy would become almost meaningless. Take the common objection that many people seek death under economic hardship, trauma, neglect, social isolation, chronic pain, disability, or narratives of burdensomeness. Even if that claim is true in many cases, it does not do the work prohibitionists want it to do. Those pressures already exist. They are not created by assisted dying law. They are features of the world as it currently stands. People are already poor. People are already lonely. People are already abandoned. People are already in pain. Disabled people are already devalued. The chronically ill are already pushed to justify their care. The isolated are already made to feel surplus. These are not hypothetical distortions introduced by legal access to death. They are the ordinary coercive background of social life under unjust conditions. That means the prohibitionist argument arrives late and morally confused. Society allows these conditions to grind people down for years, sometimes decades, then suddenly discovers its concern for vulnerability precisely at the point where the person seeks control over their own fate. It does not rescue them from the conditions that make life unbearable. It simply tells them that because their circumstances are compromised, their refusal no longer counts. This is not protection. It is an additional domination layered on top of existing misery. The idea that vulnerability nullifies autonomy is especially ugly because it always falls hardest on those already most burdened. If poverty, disability, chronic pain, trauma, and social abandonment are treated as reasons to deny meaningful exit rights, then the people with the least social power will also have the least sovereignty over their own existence. The state or society will effectively say, because your life has been made harsher than others, you are entitled to fewer final decisions than others. That is a perverse doctrine. It punishes vulnerability twice, first through conditions, then through paternalism. Now, an intelligent critic may answer that this is unfair because the real point is not that vulnerable people should be stripped of all agency, but that pressures can distort judgment in decisions that cannot be reversed. That is a stronger argument, but notice what it supports. It supports assessment of competence, screening for coercion, waiting periods, repeated requests, opportunities to reconsider, and access to alternatives, if the person wants them. It supports procedural caution. It does not support denying the underlying right as such. Once the objection is phrased properly, it shrinks from an argument for prohibition to an argument for design. This is where defenders of broad access should be precise. The claim is not that all expressions of a wish to die must be instantly affirmed without review. The claim is that competent adults should not be categorically denied the authority to refuse continued existence simply because some cases are hard, some motives are mixed, or some contexts are unjust. Human choices are always made amid pressure. People consent to surgery while frightened, marry while lonely, relocate while desperate, remain in jobs under economic compulsion, and have children under social expectation and emotional confusion. The presence of pressure does not erase agency. If it did, the law would have to treat almost all major decisions as suspect. It does not. It only does this when a person's conclusion threatens the social expectation that they remain available to life. Another weak move in the standard objection is the word treatable. Opponents often imply that if a person's suffering is technically treatable or partly remediable, then their desire to die is invalid. But treatable is not the same as meaningfully alleviable in a way acceptable to the person. A treatment may be inaccessible, financially impossible, medically intolerable, psychologically destructive, only modestly effective, burdensome beyond reason, or capable of restoring someone merely to a state they still reject. It is not a moral answer to say that some intervention exists in theory. If the treatment does not actually provide a life the person wishes to endure, the mere existence of that intervention settles nothing. This matters because many systems quietly replace personal judgment with professional optimism. The individual says, "I find this life unbearable." The institution responds, "We believe improvement is possible." But possibility is not ownership. Professionals do not bear the burden of living the life in question. They do not occupy the body, the mind, the history, the losses, the fatigue, the prognosis, or the existential position of the person before them. Their forecasts may deserve consideration, but they do not deserve final authority. A competent adult does not lose authorship over their own threshold of intolerability just because a clinician can imagine a different relationship to suffering. There is also a deep dishonesty in the way many democracies handle death already. The law already permits numerous slow, indirect, medically mediated, and socially tolerated pathways toward death. People may refuse life-sustaining treatment. Terminal sedation is accepted in many contexts. Risky surgeries are permitted. Harmful substances are widely available. Dangerous labor is normalized. High-speed self-endangerment is glorified. Cigarettes and alcohol remain legal despite their predictable lethality. What is prohibited is not death as such, nor even knowingly life-shortening conduct. What is prohibited is clear, dignified, deliberate self-authorship that does not hide behind some other accepted category. In other words, society already permits self-destruction so long as it arrives disguised, delayed, or institutionally familiar. It objects not to the outcome, but to the candor. That hypocrisy should offend anyone who values either honesty or mercy. A regime that tolerates decades of self-harm, legal poisoning, and passive medical dying while condemning explicit voluntary exit is not operating from coherent moral principle. It is enforcing a cultural script. It prefers death that comes by attrition, ambiguity, or bureaucratic distance over death chosen plainly. The result is cruelty masquerading as care. People are left to suffer through prolonged decline, risky improvisation, or lonely violent acts, not because these outcomes are safer or more humane, but because they better preserve social illusions. This is why the slippery slope argument also tends to be overstated. The fear is that if access to assisted dying is broadened, society will begin steering huge numbers of people toward death as an easy substitute for justice. But this prediction often exaggerates both human psychology and democratic friction. Most people do not choose death simply because it is legally available. Human beings are attached to life in stubborn, irrational, and often almost comic ways. They adapt to astonishing hardship. They cling to routine, obligation, hope, fear, love, resentment, curiosity, inertia, and unfinished business. They bargain. They delay. They endure. They fight for better conditions even under disgraceful circumstances. Legal availability does not erase these attachments. So the fantasy that broad access would produce immediate mass social surrender is usually melodramatic. A more plausible concern is selective abuse. Not that everyone would be nudged toward death, but that some groups could be more exposed to subtle pressure than others. That is real. Bureaucracies are capable of neglect. Democracies are capable of hypocrisy. Institutions may find it easier to process suffering than to solve it. Yet this concern still does not justify denying the right itself. It justifies building a system that separates voluntary, competent refusal from coercion, abandonment, and administrative convenience. A democracy already balances rights against possible abuse in many areas. It does not abolish freedom of association because some relationships are coercive. It does not abolish reproduction, though it should, because some parents are negligent. It does not abolish contract because some contracts are exploitative. It tries, imperfectly, to distinguish legitimate exercise from abuse. Assisted dying should be treated no differently. Indeed, one might argue that democratic societies are better placed than authoritarian ones to manage this issue precisely because abuse is contestable. Courts, media, professional bodies, patient advocates, disability organizations, civil liberties groups, and opposition parties all create friction. Public scrutiny exists. Policy can be revised. Review mechanisms can be imposed. None of this eliminates danger. But it does mean that legal recognition of a right need not amount to unrestricted abandonment. Democracies are messy, not magical. That messiness is often frustrating, but here it can serve a protective function. The deeper problem with prohibition is not only that it overrides autonomy, It also rests on an inflated view of what the state is morally entitled to demand from citizens. To compel a competent person to remain alive is not a small intervention. It is not akin to requiring paperwork or setting traffic rules. It is a command that they continue enduring consciousness, embodiment, dependency, pain, fear, exhaustion, or meaninglessness for an indefinite period because others judge that preferable. This is one of the most extreme exercises of power imaginable. Yet it is often discussed as though it were the neutral baseline. It is not neutral. Forced existence is a substantive imposition. It requires justification. The burden of proof should not sit entirely on the person who wants release. It should also sit on the state that presumes the authority to deny it. The state or advocacy groups should have to prove you are either not capable of making the decision, or that you are in a crisis, or that you are being coerced. That point is rarely appreciated because life is treated as a default good, rather than an ongoing condition requiring consent. But continued existence is not morally self-justifying merely because it is biologically normal. A state may have interests in stability, public confidence, preventing impulsive harm, and protecting persons lacking capacity. It may have reasons to ensure requests are informed, persistent, and free from direct coercion. What it does not have is an unlimited claim to force a competent adult to endure life solely because life is culturally preferred. Preference is not ownership. Social attachment is not title. This brings us back to the language of consent. Opponents often mock consent-based arguments as simplistic, as though saying, my life, my choice, is somehow childish in the face of mortality. But the concept is not childish. It is foundational. Consent is what distinguishes service from slavery, intimacy from assault, treatment from battery, and governance from domination. If consent matters in relation to our bodies, our labor, our sexuality, our beliefs, and our medical care, then it cannot become irrelevant at the point where the entire burden of continued existence is in question. The stakes are higher there, not lower. If anything, that is where consent should matter most. Of course, consent alone does not answer every institutional question. Competence matters, coercion matters, information matters, durability of intention matters. But these are qualifications on the administration of the right, not refutations of the right itself. A person may need to demonstrate understanding and persistence. They need not prove worthiness according to a romantic narrative of suffering. They need not be dying enough, disabled enough, visibly tragic enough, or medically approved enough to have their refusal taken seriously. Once the system requires that kind of moral performance, it stops respecting persons and starts curating acceptable victims. The demand that someone qualify through terminal illness or officially recognized decline is especially suspect. It implies that the right to stop existing depends not on self-ownership, but on whether the body has deteriorated in a state-approved way. This turns medicine into a gatekeeper of metaphysical permission. It tells the citizen, you may exercise final autonomy only once your suffering fits categories the institution understands. Until then, your body is yours for all ordinary purposes, but not for ultimate refusal. That is arbitrary. It makes the recognition of personhood conditional on diagnosis. One can see how absurd this becomes by reversing the logic. Imagine saying that freedom of speech should exist only for those with damaged vocal cords, or that freedom of religion should apply only to those facing spiritual agony, or that the right to refuse medical treatment should be granted only to terminal patients. We would immediately see that the right had been replaced by a narrow exception dressed up as compassion. Yet this is often how assisted dying is framed, not as a liberty grounded in self-ownership, but as a medical mercy dispensed selectively to those who fit institutional criteria. There is also an argument from equality that deserves more attention. Prohibition does not affect everyone the same way. Those with physical capacity, technical knowledge, privacy, access to substances, or tolerance for risk can often act outside the law. Those without such advantages are left trapped. This means restrictive regimes do not eliminate self-chosen death. They merely stratify it. The determined, the informed, the physically able, and the socially unobserved retain practical options. The vulnerable, the dependent, the closely monitored, and the physically limited are denied them. Thus, the law often produces not equal protection, but unequal captivity. It reserves painful or precarious endurance for those least able to circumvent the rules. A regulated system could reduce that cruelty by replacing clandestine, violent, or medically chaotic paths with transparent standards. That does not mean a free-for-all. It means acknowledging reality and managing it honestly. People already decide that they are done. Some do so impulsively. Some do so after years of reflection. Some fail and suffer further. Some survive with damage. Some are discovered too late. A legal framework does not invent this human fact. It responds to it. The question is whether the response will be moral seriousness or theatrical denial. Any humane framework would have to be designed carefully. It would need robust capacity assessment, protections against direct coercion, clear documentation, opportunities for reconsideration, and real access to support for those who want alternatives. It would need to ensure that choosing life remains materially possible, not merely rhetorically praised. It would need transparency, review, and accountability so that neglect is not repackaged as consent. None of this undermines the principle. In fact, it respects it. Safeguards are strongest when they exist to protect genuine choice, not to obstruct it until the person gives up or deteriorates enough to become legible to the bureaucracy. Critics sometimes fear that broad recognition of the right would erode social solidarity by making endurance optional. But this gets things backward. Solidarity built on compulsion is morally thin. A society proves its care not by chaining people to life, but by making life meaningfully livable while still respecting those who reject it. If the only way a culture can preserve its commitment to life is by legally cornering people into continued existence, then its commitment is not compassionate. It is insecure. There is a final point that prohibitionists rarely confront. To deny competent adults final authority over their existence is to assert that the state, family, community, profession, or moral order has a superior claim over the individual's future. That is an extraordinary proposition. It means your pain may be judged tolerable by others. Your exhaustion may be overruled. Your values may be subordinated. Your threshold may be dismissed. Your body may be kept in service to a norm you no longer accept. However politely this is phrased, the substance is domination. A liberal society should be ashamed to rely on it as heavily as it does. So the argument, when stripped of melodrama and euphemism, is straightforward. Society is already filled with unequal pressure, preventable suffering, and forms of life that many people endure only by force of habit, fear, duty, or lack of alternatives. The existence of those conditions does not justify giving the state veto power over competent adults who refuse continuation. It justifies improving life wherever possible and ensuring that any system of assisted dying protects against coercion, incapacity, misinformation, and neglect. Vulnerability is not a reason to erase autonomy. Irreversibility is not a reason to nationalize a person's future. The fact that most people will keep fighting for better circumstances is not a reason to compel those who will not. A democracy that values freedom must be willing to accept that self-ownership includes the final decision, or else admit honestly that its devotion to autonomy ends where obedience to life begins. That is the core truth people keep trying to dodge. Either your life is yours in the deepest sense, or it is not. If it is yours, then the state may regulate process but not own the conclusion. If it is not yours, then all the rhetoric about liberty is thinner than advertised. The real debate is not about medicine or symbolism or discomfort or whether the public can emotionally handle the thought of voluntary death. The real debate is whether the individual is a sovereign person or a managed asset of society. Once that is stated clearly, the sentimental fog starts to burn off. And what remains is simple. No government that claims to respect bodily autonomy can consistently deny competent adults final authority over whether they continue to exist. Thank you for watching. Now get out of here.